Protect the future of America. Vote today.
These past few days has been what effect would the recent developments concerning the hostages in Iran have on the election? The answer seems to be not much. Among the people we polled who made up their minds within the past week, those who thought Iran was important favored Carter. Those who thought the debate important favored Reagan. But overall, the late deciders split about evenly between Reagan and Carter. They were a little more likely to be for Anderson than the rest of our sample. And like other Reagan and Anderson voters, lots of them felt it's time for a change. Jimmy Carter has lost ground to Ronald Reagan among some traditionally Democratic groups in our poll. The two run about even among union members, among blue-collar workers. Reagan even has a slight lead among Catholics. Carter has retained his wide lead among black voters, but Reagan leads among white Protestants. He has a much bigger lead among Southern whites than Gerald Ford had 4 years ago. The single oddest thing our poll turned up is the difference between the sexes. Carter and Reagan are dead even among women. Reagan has a whopping lead among men. Reagan leads among those who think the United States should be more forceful in its dealings with the Soviet Union, and that was a popular position among the people we interviewed. Reagan voters tended to think inflation was the most important issue, which was certainly what Reagan said during his campaign. Carter voters were more likely to cite unemployment and Iran. But overall, the message seems to be a loss of faith across the country in Jimmy Carter. About a third of the Reagan voters, as we said, and about a third of the Anderson voters said they voted that way simply because they wanted a change. And of all the people who said they voted for Carter 4 years ago, only 2 out of 3 said they'd voted for him today. That's not the kind of margin of which victories are made. Walter?
A reminder that those are the results of an exit poll, as we call it, a poll of voters as they left the polling places across the country at randomly selected precincts. Dan Rather has more on the Midwest returns as we've got them so far, and particularly the state of Indiana. The poll is closed, and we've got some pretty good returns.
Walter, Halloween has come a little bit late for Democrats in Indiana. The Republicans have swept all 3 major races in the state. As expected, Ronald Reagan won the Hoosier state, but his strong showing in Indiana's bigger cities may spell trouble for Jimmy Carter throughout the Midwest later in the evening. Birch Bayh, an 18-year Senate veteran, was swept away in the Republican tide by Dan Quayle, the first gain for the Republicans in the Senate this evening. And Robert Orr was elected to succeed fellow Republican Otis Bowen as governor. The stakes are high for Jimmy Carter in Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan, and we'll be watching for early trends from those states. We expect to have some fairly shortly. Jimmy Carter, who came to Washington, Walter, 4 years ago with the strategy of building a new personal coalition outside the traditional Democratic base, is in trouble in the Midwest tonight because the Democratic vote has fallen apart on him and has not been replaced by any new core of support. Realizing that the president had not established any personal coalition, the Carter campaign recently began urging Democrats to, quote, come home. But early results from our exit polling in the Midwest suggest that this effort to rebuild with Democrats was too little too late. In the Midwest, Carter's share of the Democratic vote is down 15% from 1976, his biggest drop among any party bloc. The traditional Democratic constituencies in the Midwest tell the story. Carter down 20% among blue-collar voters. Carter down 17% with union voters. Carter down 11% among Catholics. The leadership of organized labor may have come home to Jimmy Carter, Walter, but our exit polling suggests that the rank and file was simply not willing to follow suit.
I mention, of course, again, that the polls have closed now in just 9 states with 89 electoral votes. That's something like 18% or something of the national electoral vote. 270 electoral votes are needed, as you know, for election of a president. And speaking of the Senate race in which Birch Bayh has been defeated in Indiana rather resoundingly by Dan Quayle, the Republican challenger, the Republicans hope very much to take several liberal seats from the Democrats this year in the Senate races, and there is a chance, if there is a very large Republican sweep across the country, that Ronald Reagan's coattails could actually give the Republicans control of the Senate for the first time since President President Eisenhower's first term back in the early 50s. There are some, and they need 9 seats altogether. If they could get all of those liberal seats, and they've got one of them now, they would only need some 5, 6 others, and there are several seats up for the Democrats this year where the Republicans have a real chance on any sizable Reagan coattail. Now let's take a look at the South. We've had returns already from Kentucky. Bob Schieffer.
Walter, in Kentucky is about the only place in the South that we have enough returns we can really talk about. Let's take a look at that Kentucky board now. It's going to show with 11% of the vote in that Ronald Reagan is leading the president with 51% of the vote tabulated so far. That really doesn't mean all that much, though, because the polls are still open in western Kentucky, which is in another time zone, in the central time zone. It was in western Kentucky that Jimmy Carter piled up a 2-to-1 lead in 1976 over Gerald Ford, and that's what enabled him to carry that state. What is interesting about what we're seeing in Kentucky so far is that in the suburbs around the cities of Kentucky, Jimmy Carter is about 10 points down as to what he was in 1976. And that could be very important, Walter, as the evening wears on, because all across the South, Jimmy Carter was able in 1976 to more or less hold his own in the suburbs, areas that had been sort of trending toward the Republican side in recent years. Mr. Carter managed to hold his own and then score heavily in those rural areas, and in doing so, he was able to sweep the South. So far, from what we've seen from our exit polls, he is not doing all that well across the region in the suburban areas. This return from Kentucky, the first solid indication that we have of that. If you want to look at that Senate race also in Kentucky, as we said just a moment ago, Wendell Ford has won, and won big. That was totally expected. He had no real competition there, and even so, spent a lot of money and campaigned very hard. Walter?
You might note that among the other indicators favoring Ronald Reagan today, as the nation went to the polls, were the odds in Las Vegas and in London. It's not legal to bet on elections even in Las Vegas, but it is in London. They don't care whether we bet on our elections or not. But at both places, suddenly on the morning line, Reagan went way ahead. 9-5 in Las Vegas and 5-1 in London today. Harry Reasoner, who never bets on anything as far as I know, is watching the East for us tonight. Maybe willing to put up a little money now.
You're not suggesting the election was fixed, Harry Walter. The East is... The East, I think people tend to go to work later and work later in the evening than they do in the Midwest and the West, and the East has produced no real results yet. In New Hampshire, for instance, they've got a percentage report indicating that 76% have voted for Reagan against 20% for Carter, but that represents a...
States down there that are going Republican. We'll have more coverage of the 1980 election after this.
The thing we've got in the rest of the country is the results of the exit poll, and the most interesting thing that shows so far is that New York, the second biggest electoral prize in the country with 41 votes, is very, very close indeed. There's a detailed poll of people leaving the polling places in New York, and as opposed to being regarded as fairly...
You ask if the election were fixed. If I thought so, in one polling place, one precinct in the south wards of Chicago, guess what? The precinct opened this morning, and already 25 votes were recorded on it. It doesn't say for whom, but a complaint has been issued, you can be sure. How about the West? Leslie Stahl, what can we look for out there tonight? You don't have any returns yet, I know.
No, and I won't for quite a while, Walter, but we do have...
Well, stand by, though.
Oh, good. Oh, good. We do have returns from our CBS Election Day poll, and it shows, at least it appears from the poll, that Jimmy Carter's campaign to portray Ronald Reagan as a warmonger backfired. Initial returns from our poll in the West suggest that the war-peace issue worked for Reagan and not against him. Majorities in the region think we should be more forceful with the Soviets, even if it increases our chances of war. This is a region where more voters are concerned about U.S. prestige around the world than they're concerned about the crisis in Iran. The number one reason Reagan voters give for supporting him is that he is a strong leader. You know, about half the voters in California, in the region, live in California, and Ronald Reagan was governor, and it obviously was difficult to persuade people in California that Ronald Reagan was that warlike after all, since when he was governor, doom and destruction did not come to that state.
takers from NBC News and the Associated Press. They've given them information that makes us believe that a substantial victory will be awarded to Governor Reagan tonight in the balloting. A substantial victory. He's in California. John Anderson, the independent candidate, is at a hotel in Washington, and the president is at the White House. 3 reports now, the first one from Judy Woodruff at the White House.
The only way to describe the mood here at the White House, John, is just to say that it's very sad. No one is commenting on the record at this point, but aides who are working in the press office are wearing grim expressions. They're staying very quiet. Perhaps the best indicator was Jody Powell's teenage daughter, Emily, who I saw a few minutes ago with tears in her eyes. Reporters haven't seen the president since he flew back to Washington from Georgia earlier today, where he voted. But when he spoke to the townspeople in Plains this morning, almost 12 hours ago, he choked up as he talked about hoping that he had fulfilled his commitment to the people of his region. I think it was evident at that point to the people who have been following the president in this long campaign that the president knew what was ahead. We have been told not to expect any statement from Mr. Carter until about the time the polls close on the West Coast, and of course that's several hours from now. But it does seem obvious that the miracle story of Jimmy Carter, the unknown Georgia governor who finally made it to the White House, is just about at an end. And now we switch to Chris Wallace, who is outside the Reagan home in California.
1669 San Onofre Drive, Reagan's residence in the Pacific Palisades, a spot that could be as famous tomorrow as Plains, Georgia is today. The Reagan camp fully expects that, openly predicting victory for several days now. Reagan spent this afternoon at his home with top aides discussing the start of a possible administration. One state that the Reagan camp will be looking at very closely in the next hour is Kentucky, a border state they say will indicate how Reagan will do in Ohio to the north and in Jimmy Carter's southern base. Of course, the victory already in Florida indicates that Reagan is in good shape in the South, but a victory in Kentucky in this next hour might indicate a landslide across the Midwest. In about an hour, Reagan will leave his home and drive to a dinner with close friends. Later, he'll go to a hotel to watch the final returns, something that people here are looking forward to. Now to Jim Cummins at Anderson headquarters in Washington.
Here at Anderson headquarters, the ballroom at the Hyatt Regency in Washington is just now beginning to fill up. We expect it to be full within the hour with volunteers for Anderson. There won't be much tension here tonight. His people, Anderson's people, had considered him out of the race a long time ago. During the campaign, it was said Anderson had trouble broadening his base, that his primary supporters were white, upper class or upper middle class, liberal, the so-called wine and cheese set. Well, for the record, they've already brought out the cheese here tonight, and we expect the wine to arrive later. We are told that Congressman Anderson will come to the hotel within the hour and go right to his suite to watch the returns come in, and that he will come down here after the election is decided to make a statement to his supporters. Tom?
Thank you, Jim. No single night in America may have so many highs and lows as an election night, the winners and the losers. Jessica Savage is going to be keeping track of many of them, the House and the governors. Jessica?
And we have a projection here, Tom. NBC News now projects that Richard Snelling will be elected governor of Vermont. Snelling is running well ahead of his challenger, Democrat M. Jerome Diamond. He's the 3-term attorney general for the state. And NBC News again projects that Richard Snelling will be the winner in the gubernatorial race in Vermont. This is one of...
...been their daily bread. Those of you who might speak Spanish, who might be black, who might be women, remember, said Carter, who's been your friend. And there under the California sun in San Diego at a shopping center, Ronald Reagan was delivering himself of one of those patriotic soliloquies at which he's been a master since his days at Eureka College. Suddenly, hecklers in the crowd started shouting and waving their ERA signs. Reagan took his cue and snapped back, "Oh, shut up." And thousands of supporters roared their approval. Those are the people for whom Ronald Reagan is the apostle of the rollback, the knight who promises finally to slay the dragon of liberal government. Never mind that if Reagan wins, he will arrive in the White House deeply in hock to interest groups that want a bigger government for their own purposes. It's the marquee that counts. Jimmy Carter won 4 years ago as an outsider, and if he wins at all tonight, it must be as an insider defending the status quo. Reagan has cast himself as a sheriff who comes riding into town just in the nick of time shouting, "Enough's enough." As the governor of Montana said recently, it's Washington that is bugging us, and Carter represents Washington. So this last day comes down to a test between those who like what government has done for them, no matter how poorly, and those who don't like what government is doing to them, no matter how necessary. The defeat of the liberal Birch Bayh in Indiana suggests the nays are out in force. Walter?
Bill, thank you. One of the problems and the questions has been how large is the turnout today. The Democrats said they needed a large turnout in order to assure victory for Jimmy Carter. The early reports from various state election officials indicated a heavy turnout, but then that is always the case. It seems that every election day, the state officials say it's the heaviest turnout they've ever seen, and then it always ends up being just about what we've seen over the last few presidential elections, something around 50 to 55% of the registered voters get out there to vote. And it looks that could be that again this year. About 85 million would have voted today if the average is about what it has been in the last few years. For instance, 76, when it was 54%, that would be around 85, 86 million of us who went to the polls today. We don't know yet just how big that turnout really was. We'll be able to tell a little bit later on. Phil Jones has the view now from Democratic campaign headquarters in Washington. Phil?
Walter, this is the Sheraton Washington Ballroom where the Democrats are hoping to have their victory celebration later tonight. It will actually open to the public in about 40 minutes. They are going to have a cash bar here. They have about 250 quarts of liquor, about 50 gallons of wine, and about 50 kegs of beer. And the bartenders aren't exactly sure just how the results tonight will affect consumption. They also plan another party just off of this ballroom a little later in the evening, $100 per person, and that will involve people who were very actively involved financially and otherwise in the Carter campaign. But right now, you know, it's very difficult to detect any mood of victory around here. In fact, it's very reminiscent of 4 years ago when I stood right here in this very ballroom waiting for a victory celebration, and that night it had been rented by the Republican National Committee.
They recorded here the second percent of the vote counted across the country in the popular vote, 2% of the vote in now, and it shows that the margin is just about the same for Reagan over Carter, 53 to 42%, 4% for John Anderson. We've been able to say tonight on the basis of our CBS News selected precincts that Reagan has won the state of Indiana, the only state that we are able to say yet has been put into the Reagan column. But also in Indiana, a very important senatorial race, and Dan Rather's been looking more closely at it. Dan?
Walter, Birch Bayh not only lost, but apparently lost badly. This is a state that everyone before the election expected would go for Ronald Reagan. But Birch Bayh was a three-term Democratic senator. He was one of those senators targeted by defeat by the more conservative elements of the Republican Party. It may spell bad news later in the evening for some of those liberal Democratic senators farther out to the west, McGovern, Culver, Nelson, and here's why. Bayh was running on what he said was his record. He went home to Indiana and said, I've been a great senator. Never mind that you're going to vote for Ronald Reagan, stick with me. But Bayh said, for every 2 votes that Jimmy Carter loses, I will lose 1. And that's the way it worked out.
Thank you, Dan. We will be looking, of course, very closely tonight at those other Senate races. As Dan pointed out, Senator McGovern, who carried his party's banner in 1972 and went down to one of the worst defeats of any Democratic candidate in recent memory. He is up for re-election this year and is facing a very difficult fight in South Dakota, where he has been targeted by conservative elements as well. And Frank Church, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, also has been targeted in his state of Idaho, and that will be a close race too, particularly if Reagan has some broad coattails out in that section of the country. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.